My name is Elizabeth Harper, and I'm 34 years old. I've just been appointed the youngest federal judge in the state of New York. People look at me with admiration, thinking I have it all: status, intelligence, strength. But there's one thing nobody knows. Right in the middle of presiding over a major civil trial, my clerk handed me an envelope with no return address. I opened it. Inside were just 6 words, written in a cold, sharp hand. "Don't trust Matthew." He lied. Matthew is my brother. A renowned surgeon, the media's golden child, and the picture-perfect son in my parents' eyes. In 3 weeks, he'll be hosting his wedding at our family's inherited estate. A lavish event, where everyone is invited, except me. None of them know that I've secretly funded most of that wedding through an anonymous trust left to me by my grandfather. I did it because of an old promise, not out of love. But now, with one small piece of paper, the truth I buried is starting to resurface. Have you ever felt like your family treated you like a shadow, only to later realize you were the only one holding everything together? Leave a comment if you've ever been hurt by your own family. Hit like if you believe justice isn't about blood, it's about choice. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because the next chapter of this story is when all the masks begin to fall. I still remember that day. It was a Wednesday. New York was damp and cold, wind slamming against my office window like it was trying to awaken memories I had buried for years. The morning's hearing had just wrapped up. I returned to my private office to find a small envelope sitting alone on my desk. No return name, no postage mark. Just a plain ivory envelope, carefully placed as if someone had hesitated before leaving it behind. I opened it. Inside was a wedding invitation. Gold-embossed details. Delicate, handwritten script. Matthew Harper and Lauren Davis. Cordially invite. I didn't need to read the rest. My hand froze when I saw the name line. Elizabeth Harper, Honorable Judge. No one in my family ever called me by that title. Pressed between the elegant folds of the invitation was a small note. Just one line, handwritten, slightly tilted but unmistakably clear. You have the right to know. Don't let them erase you from the story. I sat still for several minutes. It wasn't my mother's handwriting, nor my father's, nor Matthew's. I knew each of their scripts well after years of reviewing medical reports, family memos, and academic letters my father had once asked me to proofread when I was still a med student. Whoever wrote this note wasn't from inside the family, but was close enough to know our secrets. I turned the envelope over. No name, but the logo on the seal was from Street. Clare Memorial Hospital, my parents' private hospital. A cold chill crawled up my spine. That afternoon, I called Maya, my best friend, and a former senior nurse in the cardiology unit at Street Clare before she moved to Brooklyn. Her voice came through after 2 rings. "What's going on? You sound like you're about to draft a warrant." I couldn't laugh. I just received Matthew's wedding invite from an anonymous source. There was a note inside, saying I have the right to know. Maya paused for a few seconds, then exhaled. "I figured you'd get it eventually." I snapped my head up. "It was you?" "No, but whoever sent it, definitely someone from the hospital." Maya hesitated. "I think it was Ellie, that intern from last year. She saw what happened, back then." That last phrase hit like a needle straight to my brain. Back then. Those 2 words had been my way of avoiding the truth for nearly a decade. Back then was when I was a 3rd-year med student, interning at my family's hospital. Back then was when I was assigned to monitor a post-op patient, a man in his early 50s who didn't survive due to a septic complication. I'd written in my report that there had been a sterilization failure during the initial procedure, that the wound was overlooked and not properly followed up. But when the internal investigation happened, all blame fell on me, the inexperienced student, who failed to observe protocol, who lacked evidence. My father said nothing. Matthew, already a resident by then, said nothing. I was told to withdraw from the honors residency program. When I resisted, my mother simply said, "Elizabeth, don't make things worse. You know what your father's protecting." That was the day I packed my bags and left home. No goodbye, no embrace. I chose law. I studied at night, Worked during the day, lived in a cramped apartment in Queens. Climbing step by step, case by case, sleepless nights reviewing files, enduring the patronizing stares of seasoned attorneys. I rebuilt my life, brick by brick. On the rubble they left me. And now, I hold the gavel. While they still live in a world shielded by reputation and lies, I took a deep breath, folded the invitation, and slid it into a drawer. Then I stood up, walking toward the window, staring down at the river of people below. Lauren Davis. I'd never met her in person, only seen her in a medical journal photo Matthew once sent. A beautiful woman, blonde hair, calm expression. Maybe she didn't know anything about what happened between me and my family. Maybe, like most others, she only knew the version of the truth they chose to share. That evening, just as the lights in my apartment blinked on, my phone vibrated. A text message with no name. He let a patient die, and never answered for it. Maybe it's time Lauren knew. I stared at the screen. Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room, pretend I hadn't read it, but I couldn't. I unlocked my phone and messaged Maya. "Do you still have Mr. Patterson's old file?" She replied with one word, "Yes." I typed back, "Send it to me. Let's meet tomorrow." I knew I was stepping into a darkness I might not be able to come back from. But if I didn't step forward, I'd always be left outside the gates of truth. I wasn't that trembling student anymore. I write the law. I guard justice. The next morning, I met Maya at a small cafe near Midtown, the kind we used to haunt as students. The air was crisp, but my body felt hot, like every cell was pulsing with the memories I'd kept locked away. Maya sat at the corner table, leather bag beside her, holding a steaming latte. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes more serious than usual. I sat across without saying much. We didn't need to. For two people who had weathered overnight ER shifts and law paper deadlines side by side, words felt unnecessary. "You sure you want to look at this file?" Maya placed a thick, sealed envelope in front of me. "I've kept it in my private safe for 6 years." I didn't say a word. I simply reached out and took it. Inside was the full copy of the medical file for a patient named Richard Patterson, the man who didn't survive his operation due to post-surgical complications. His death didn't just end a life, it ended the last thread connecting me to my family. I remember it clearly. That day, I was assigned to monitor Mr. Patterson's recovery. I noticed signs of infection at the incision site as early as the second day. I documented everything, but my notes were wiped from the system. I went down to the records room, printed the earlier version to prove my point. But when I brought the file into the meeting room to raise my concern, my father stood up in front of the entire executive board and declared, "This young woman is overstepping her authority, drawing conclusions without first consulting the attending physician. She is neither qualified nor authorized to evaluate the treatment protocol." I went numb. I turned to Matthew. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the glass of water in front of him, as if nothing happening in that room involved him at all. But I knew better. He was the one who had requested to shorten the post-op monitoring so the patient could be moved to recovery sooner because the operating room was needed for a VIP surgery the next day. A resident surgeon had no authority to make that call, but my father had approved it without question because he trusted his only son above anyone else. When I objected, when I threatened to file a report with the medical board, my father slammed the office door shut and pointed a finger in my face. "You're trying to destroy this family because you're jealous of your brother?" I was speechless. I had never imagined the man I admired growing up would see me as a threat just because I refused to stay silent. My mother just cried. She didn't take sides. She didn't speak up. She held her forehead and kept repeating the same thing. "Elizabeth, you don't understand. Don't ruin our family's reputation." I understood, all too well. That night, I packed my things. No one stopped me. No one said goodbye. I left the house I grew up in like a stranger. I rented a damp little room in Brooklyn, worked part-time at a bookstore during the day, waited tables at night. Every dollar I made went into a savings jar for law school. I had no backing. No one wrote me recommendations. No one vouched for me at scholarship interviews. But I had the truth. And I had a quiet, searing rage that never burned out. Maya was the only one who never left me. Even though she stayed at my family's hospital a little longer, she slipped me documents each week, evidence to defend myself. Original reports, scans from the system before they were altered. We both knew no one would believe a nameless med student going up against one of the most elite medical families in New York. But I kept every piece, not to sue, but to remember, to make sure that one day I wouldn't doubt myself. Elizabeth. Maya's voice pulled me back. What are you going to do with this file? I clutched the pages in my hand. I don't know yet. But do you remember what my father said that day? What did he say? If you leave medicine, you'll no longer be part of this family. I looked up at Maya. Well, maybe now that his daughter has become a federal judge, this family should remember exactly who they chose to lose. Maya didn't say anything. Her face showed nothing but sorrow. I always believed you, Liz. Even when everyone called you a liar. I gave a faint smile. They needed someone to blame. And a young woman who refused to bow to lies is always the easiest target. I left the cafe with the envelope tucked tightly in my bag. That night, I opened it again when I got home. The first page was the edited report with a clumsy forged version of my signature that looked like someone had tried too hard to copy it. The next page was the original, the one Maya helped me keep bearing my real signature, a clear timestamp, and the unaltered metadata from the hospital system. Side by side, they were undeniable proof of falsified records. But I didn't need it to press charges. I had already won in the one place they never expected me to. I had built a life without them. And now, as a wedding invitation arrived from the very place that had erased me from its lineage, I couldn't help but find it bitterly ironic. They used to call me the destroyer, the little sister who didn't understand. But now, they stand on a foundation built from the very silence they forced me to swallow. The only difference is, I stopped being silent a long time ago. And this time, I'm not attending as a guest. I'm arriving with the truth. I sat in my office that late afternoon, autumn sunlight slanting through the wide window behind my desk. The tea in my cup had gone cold, but I didn't notice. On the computer screen, the case file for Hartman Properties remained open, the plaintiff's name bold on the first page, Lauren Davis. That name had never stood out, just one among hundreds of case files I handled every week. But once the anonymous letter arrived, the pieces started fitting together. Lauren was one of the lead attorneys representing the East Bronx residents who were being displaced by Hartman to make room for luxury apartments. I'd presided over that trial. I remembered Lauren, clearly bright eyes, precise arguments, never interrupting others, but never letting herself be spoken over either. She wasn't just good. She cared deeply about the community she served. I'd ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, ordering Hartman to compensate and preserve a portion of the property as a community center. After the hearing, Lauren approached me in the hallway, bowed slightly, and said, "Thank you for listening. Very few judges still believe in justice in its truest form." I nodded, gave a polite reply, never realizing that the woman standing in front of me would one day be engaged to the man who nearly ruined my life. I still remember her smile that day, sincere, unguarded. And what chills me now is that she had no idea who I was, not just who I am as a judge, but that I'm Matthew Harper's sister. I opened a new tab and typed in, Lauren Davis plus Matthew Harper engagement. Dozens of search results appeared instantly, medical journal write-ups, hospital announcements, photos from a beachfront engagement. In every article, not a word about Lauren's family. Every detail centered around Matthew, his research, awards, and a brief note. Lauren Davis, public interest attorney with the New York City Legal Initiative. No mention of her being the future daughter-in-law of one of the city's most powerful medical dynasties. No family photos. No congratulatory messages from my mother, the same woman who normally paraded her. Presence at every event. This told me one thing clearly. Either Lauren was being kept at a distance, or she was being deceived. I leaned back in my chair, eyes tracing the ceiling. Part of me wanted to leave it all alone. Let whatever's coming, come. I owed nothing to that family. But another part, the one that kept Mr. Patterson's file all these years, the one that still flinched when hearing the name Harper on the news, refused to stay quiet. Lauren was smart. She didn't need my protection. But if she was walking into a marriage with a version of Matthew Harper that had been scrubbed clean and polished, if she didn't know the man she was marrying once climbed to success by stepping over the dying, then I had a role to play. That night, I called Maya. "Have you ever met Lauren outside of court?" I asked, as she answered with jazz music humming softly in the background. "Lauren Davis? Once, at a legal conference last year. She's very principled, respected, in the public interest circle." "Why?" I hesitated. "She's Matthew's fiancée." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Maya let out a sharp, stunned breath. "What?" "That's right. And she has no idea I'm his sister. Elizabeth, so that means she doesn't know what happened back then, about Patterson, about how my family dumped everything on me." Maya's voice dropped. "What are you going to do?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the files still open on my screen. The glow of the monitor casting light over a portrait of Lauren, smiling brightly, not a trace of doubt in her eyes. "I'm not sure. But I can't let someone like her walk into a family where the lies are hidden behind a glittering wedding." The next morning, I made the decision to visit Legal Initiative, the office where Lauren worked. No appointment, no warning. I wore a neutral-toned business suit, didn't wear my judge's badge, and used no trace of my legal name. I didn't want to apply pressure or turn it into a confrontation. I just wanted to understand her. The Legal Initiative office was on the third floor of an old building in southern Manhattan. The hallway was narrow but clean, covered with community bulletin boards. I knocked on the door labeled Lauren Davis, attorney at law. A clear voice rang out from inside. "Come in." I pushed the door open. Lauren was sitting behind her desk, hair neatly tied up, jotting notes onto a document. She looked up, and her eyes recognized me almost instantly. "Judge Harper?" She stood quickly, surprised but composed. "I didn't expect to see you here." I smiled. "I apologize for not reaching out beforehand. I just wanted to talk for a moment, if you have a few minutes." She nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Of course, you're someone I deeply respect. Please, have a seat." I sat down, stayed silent for a few seconds, then asked, "Have you ever looked me up? I mean, outside of court records?" Lauren shook her head. "Not really. I know you're one of the youngest judges in the state, and I've read your articles on family law reform. They're insightful. But other than that, no." "Why?" I nodded slightly. "You're getting married to Matthew Harper, aren't you?" Lauren paused. A flicker of suspicion crossed her eyes. "Yes." "Do you know him?" "Matthew is my brother." Silence. As if the air in the room suddenly thickened. Lauren stared at me without blinking, as if checking whether she had heard me correctly. "Your brother?" "Yes. I'm Elizabeth Harper. I changed how I used my name after graduating law school, for personal reasons." She slowly set her pen down. "Oh my God. I had no idea." I looked her straight in the eyes. "I think it's time you knew a little more about the family you're about to marry into." Lauren didn't say anything. She just nodded, slowly, her eyes watching me as if trying to find the truth in every expression on my face. I knew that moment was the beginning of a conversation I never thought I'd have to lead. But I also knew, if anyone deserved to know the truth, it was her. I left Lauren's office as the afternoon sunlight began to slant gold across the windows of the building. She hadn't said much after I revealed my identity. Just one sentence, "I need time to process this." But the look she gave me then wasn't the admiring gaze of a colleague or the polite nod of a fellow attorney. It was the look of someone who had just realized everything she'd been told might only be a fraction of the truth. I understood that feeling. I had lived with it for almost 10 years. That evening, I returned home, to the old apartment in Brooklyn I had never moved out of. even though I could now afford something much larger and nicer. Maybe because here, I still held the clearest memories of the days I first walked. Away from my family. The winter nights with no heater, the instant noodles, the stacks of law school materials piled across the floor. This was where I learned to stand up on my own, when no one else believed in me but me. I opened the bottom drawer of my bookshelf and pulled out an old wooden box with worn corners. It was the last thing my grandfather left for me before he passed. On the day of his funeral, while everyone gathered around the dinner table, sharing stories about the great surgeries he performed, his attorney quietly handed it to me and said, "He told me to give this to you only when you feel the need to reconnect with your roots." I had kept it unopened for 8 years. Now, I placed the box on the table, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the latch. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, a thick envelope, and a small handwritten note in the slanted script I knew so well. "Elizabeth, you're the only one in this family who still has my eyes, the ones that see what's right. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." I opened the notebook first. It wasn't a diary. Each page contained scattered thoughts, reflections not in chronological order, but filled with clarity and insight. Some pages talked about my father, his rigid ideals of medicine, but blindness toward ethics. Other pages mentioned Matthew, brilliant, capable, but prone to becoming lost in the maze of prestige. And then came the final lines. "The true legacy of this family is not the hospital, not the plaques or the medical journals. It's the courage to choose what's right, even when your own blood turns its back. If you're reading this, open the envelope." I quietly set the notebook aside and opened the remaining envelope. Inside was a revised copy of a will, a Swiss bank account statement, and a small handwritten slip. This account holds the full financial records of St. Clair Hospital from 2005 to 2018. The ones your father never let the auditors see. The password is the date you failed your first anatomy exam because you stayed up all night helping a homeless patient fill out an insurance form. I gasped. I remembered that day. Everyone scolded me for being unprofessional. But Grandpa brought me a bowl of hot soup, sat next to me, and said, "Never let anyone make you believe that kindness is a weakness." I opened my laptop, navigated to the financial system listed on the paper, entered the password. The interface loaded with hundreds of categorized records, marked by year, expense reports, internal fund transfers, and a separate list labeled Special Payments. Recipient name, Matthew Harper. Description, off insurance payout, internal settlement, not disclosed in public reports. Amount, $250,000. I clicked the attached note. A detailed entry appeared. Settlement cost for R. Patterson case. Processed through intermediary law firm. Untraceable. The date matched exactly with the time shortly after Mr. Patterson's death. 1 week after I left the hospital. My heart pounded like a gavel striking the bench. This wasn't just silence. This wasn't just cover-up. They had used money, hospital money, to bury everything, and to protect Matthew's career, and they left me to bear the consequences. I kept flipping through the files. There were 3 more cases within 5 years. The amounts ranged from tens of thousands to several $100,000, all described with the same phrases. Internal resolution, reputation, protection, preserving physician image, all tied to Matthew. I no longer felt anger, not shock, just cold, a chill that settled into my bones. A silence that had lingered for years was no longer vague, it was now a documented, archived, and systematic truth. I shut the laptop. I stood up, walked to the liquor cabinet, and poured a glass of bourbon. It was the only thing I ever drank, the same brand my grandfather used to enjoy. I sat down, eyes drifting to the notebook he left behind. I had thought I had to choose between forgiveness and confrontation, but he had made it clear. Choose what's right, even if it means being hated. And I knew I wasn't fighting a personal battle anymore. This was about the truth. About others who may have also been pushed out of the light like I was. The nameless patients, the hidden payments, the mistakes buried beneath the title of doctor. I gripped the glass firmly. My hands no longer trembled. Now I had everything, and I knew what to do. That morning, I stepped out the door with my hair neatly pinned, wearing a plum-colored sheath dress that hugged my figure with tailored precision. Maya had picked it, saying it was powerful enough to silence a room, elegant enough to speak without words. I didn't argue. The car dropped me off in front of the Morningside Hotel on Fifth Avenue, where Lauren had sent an invitation a few days before. A light tea and dress fitting, she called it. No one else knew that the invite was the result of a 3-hour conversation between two women, one about to marry into a prestigious family, and one long erased from it. She hadn't invited me out of affection, but out of trust. "I'm finalizing the prenuptial agreement. I'd like you to review it," Lauren had written in her message. Not as a lawyer, but as the only person brave enough to tell me the truth. I hadn't responded, but I showed up. The hotel lobby was flooded with natural light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Soft piano music floated from a corner, and the air carried a hint of white flowers. A few guests had already arrived. Most were Lauren's friends. A couple I recognized as physicians from the hospital where Matthew worked, and especially my mother seated far off in a silver-gray dress, eyes glued to her phone. I walked in, my heels clicked lightly, against the marble floor, each step clear above the soft murmur of fading chatter. One of Lauren's friends nudged another. A woman looked up and whispered something, her eyes wide as if witnessing something surreal. Then I saw Matthew. He was standing beside Lauren, leaning in like he was asking her something, looking just as polished as he always did in public. But when our eyes met, his entire body froze. I said nothing. Just gave him a small nod. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Lauren turned to me, her smile calm and unwavering despite her fiancé's shock. "You're here. I'm glad." I stepped forward and gently shook her hand. "Hello, Lauren." My mother looked at me like she couldn't believe her eyes. She slowly put down her phone and rose to her feet. I could hear whispers from the cousins and old family friends, the same ones who sided with Matthew the night I left home now, staring at me like I had just walked out of a courtroom. "Elizabeth," my mother said, her voice hoarse. "You actually came?" I turned to her, offering a polite smile. "Hello, Mother. It's a special occasion, isn't it?" The room felt like it had turned to stone. Lauren hesitated, looking between me and Matthew, then motioned to the attendant. "Please bring the contract." I sat down at the long, white-draped table, pulled out a chair without waiting for permission. A stack of documents was placed in front of me. I flipped through the first few pages. Standard terms, division of assets, real estate, ownership of shares in the private hospital. But on page 12, I stopped. Clause 6.1. Assets and income generated from the professional activities of Party A, Matthew Harper, both prior to and following the marriage, shall be considered separate property and not subject to community property laws. I looked at Lauren. "Did you read this part carefully?" She nodded. "Yes. I thought it was standard." I gently set the contract down. "It's standard when both parties are transparent from the start. But are you sure you know what that income includes?" No one spoke. I felt every pair of eyes on me. Lauren furrowed her brows, her first visible crack of uncertainty all afternoon. "What are you implying?" I looked directly at Matthew, who was still trying to hold it together. "You can ask him." "About the income in 2017, the settlement paid quietly in connection to the death of Mr. Richard Patterson." Lauren turned sharply. "What?" Matthew clenched his fists. "That was an unfortunate case. It doesn't concern you." I leaned back. "You're right. It doesn't, unless you're using money from those settlements to maintain the perfect image she's about to marry." Lauren's eyes widened. "You told me he died from uncontrollable complications." I spoke slowly. "He died from a post-op infection, and because the recovery period was shortened to free up a bed for a VIP case, he made the request. My father approved it, and I took the blame." Matthew growled. "You have no proof." I didn't flinch. "I do." I pulled a bank statement from my bag and placed it on the table. No need for explanation. Lauren opened it, her expression darkening with each page. The room was silent enough to hear a spoon clink against glass at the neighboring table. My mother stood frozen, hands slightly trembling, her gaze darting between me and Matthew. She had never heard me speak of this before. Maybe she never wanted to. I turned to the staff member still waiting for a signature. Record the title properly, as instructed. Judge Elizabeth Harper, I stated clearly. I confirm that I have reviewed and provided a neutral legal opinion on the agreement. The recorder gave a small nod. And at the exact moment the fountain pen touched paper, I heard a sharp gasp behind me. And out of him, but I didn't turn around. I stood, locking eyes with Lauren once more. She said nothing, but I saw it in her face, the inner struggle, the flood of doubt, the dawning realization I once had years ago, when you start to question whether everything you believed was just a carefully crafted mask made of status and fear. The lights in the banquet hall shimmered as if everything had been meticulously calculated to stage the perfect rehearsal for a high society wedding. The string quartet behind us played soft, delicate notes. Champagne trays sparkled in the servers' hands. The clinking of glasses and murmurs of conversation seemed programmed to create a flawless evening. And then I walked in. I wasn't wearing anything flashy. Just a classic black dress, high neckline, long sleeves, clean lines, fabric smooth as water. But every gaze turned to me immediately. No one said my name, no one called out. But I knew they remembered. And what they remembered wasn't the woman standing in front of them now. It was the name that had once been erased from every list, wiped from every conversation, forgotten as if it had never existed. Lauren was the first to meet my eyes. She was standing beside Matthew, her hand gently resting on his elbow like a familiar anchor. When she saw me, her eyes widened briefly, then something strange happened. Her gaze lit up, almost joyful. "Elizabeth," she called, walking over. "I didn't think you'd actually come." I gave a small nod. "I said I'd consider it, and I meant it." Lauren smiled. "I really appreciate it." Then, almost unconsciously, she glanced at Matthew. "He still doesn't fully understand why I asked you here." I didn't respond. Matthew stepped forward a beat later, tension written all over his face. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tight. I looked him straight in the eye. "I was invited. Not by you, but it seems there are a few things you failed to mention to your fiancé." Lauren furrowed her brow, her fingers tightening slightly around her wine glass. "What things?" I turned to her, my tone as light as a polite conversation. "Lauren, you know who I am, don't you?" She nodded. "Of course. I've told you before. I studied law partly because of your articles. You were the first person I saw write about guardianship reform from the perspective of independent women. Your arguments inspired me." I held her gaze and asked slowly, "Then did you ever know that Matthew is my brother?" Lauren froze. The space around us seemed to slow down. A few people nearby started to take notice. The music continued, but more softly now, as if even it were cautious. Lauren turned to Matthew. "You never said a word." Matthew gave a stiff laugh, clearly trying to hold it together. "My family isn't complicated. It just wasn't the right moment to..." "Wasn't the right moment?" I cut in, raising my voice. "Not the right moment to tell your future wife that the woman she's admired for years is the very same sister you cast out?" "Elizabeth," Matthew began, but I didn't let him finish. "I get it. You're afraid Lauren will find out the truth. That you let someone die. That you ordered a patient's bed to be reassigned too early just to make room for a surgery from a high-profile family. That you used hospital funds to sweep it under the rug. And afterward, to keep your record clean, you blamed me your own sister." The clinking of glasses stopped. Conversations died out. It felt like every eye in the room had turned to us. Even the servers stood frozen, trays still in hand, as if they too needed to witness what came next. Lauren stepped back. Her face had gone pale. Is that true?" Matthew shook his head over and over, his voice cracking, panicked. "It's not what she's saying. She's always been jealous of me. Ever since med school. She couldn't stand not being the one in the spotlight. Everything she's saying, Matthew, Lauren cut him off, her voice sharp like a blade slicing through the air. She's a federal judge. Someone the entire legal community respects. Do you really think I'd buy into some petty jealousy excuse? Matthew turned to me, his face now twisted with anger. Is this what you came for? To ruin my wedding? You're so unloved you have to drag everyone else down with you? I stood firm. No. I came to make sure she, the woman who admired me for truth and integrity, won't be dragged into the same darkness I was pushed into. Lauren set her glass on the table. Her eyes were dry, no shouting, no rage. Just a cold silence that I knew Matthew had never learned to recognize. We'll talk later, she said to him. Then she walked away, cutting through the crowded hall without looking back. I stood there. I said nothing else. Matthew muttered, almost hissing. You have no idea what you've just done. I looked at him. I saw him small. Not because of his posture, not because of his words, but because of his eyes. Eyes of a man who just realized no one believed the image he had crafted anymore. I turned and walked away. The music had stopped completely. No one dared to play again. That dazzling rehearsal dinner came to a halt in an atmosphere no designer could have predicted, not because of the lights or the elegance, but because the truth had finally been spoken within walls that had only known golden lies. I hadn't even taken off my heels when the phone rang in the dark apartment. The microwave clock blinked 11:13. I had just set my bag on the table when it rang again. A strange number lit up the screen. I hesitated, but instinct told me to answer. Is this Miss Elizabeth Harper? A male voice, polite but urgent. Yes, speaking. We're calling from Lenox Hill Hospital. Dr. Robert Harper was just admitted following a transient ischemic attack. He requested to contact you immediately. I didn't speak. I didn't know how to respond. The last time my father said my name was in a tense board meeting at the hospital. He pointed at me and said, Elizabeth no longer represents the Harper legacy. And now, he was in a hospital bed, calling my name. I'll be there shortly, I said, then hung up. The late-night drizzle stung like needles on my face as I stepped outside to call a car. City lights flickered through the window, reflecting distorted images from a long night. Lauren walking away in silence, my mother's blank stare, the abrupt stop of music, and the bitter accusations from the brother I once called family. When I arrived at the hospital, the ER hallway was nearly empty. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air. A nurse led me down a row of dimly lit rooms. I saw my mother sitting on a bench, her hands tightly clasped. The fluorescent lights made her skin look as pale as paper. She looked up, and when she saw me, but didn't stand. He's waiting for you, she said softly. Only asked for you. I stepped through the emergency room door. My father lay on the hospital bed, one arm hooked to an IV, the blood pressure monitor beeping steadily. His face was paler than usual, but his eyes held the same sharp clarity I used to fear as a child. He looked at me like he had been waiting a long time. I said nothing. He raised his hand slowly, with effort, like someone who didn't have many chances left to do things on his own. Elizabeth, he said, his voice raspy, as though every syllable was pulled from deep in his chest. Come closer. I stepped forward and stood beside the bed. He touched my hand. His was dry, slightly cold, but the way he gripped it carried something oddly familiar, a trace of an old memory I had long locked away. The last time he held my hand was when I was 12, the day I won the statewide academic award. He pulled me to stand next to Matthew for a photo. He'd said, "You two are the pride of this family." But only one of us was ever mentioned again after that. Now, he looked at me. The authority in his eyes was gone, replaced by fatigue. I know you were right, he whispered. Back then, with Patterson, all of it, I knew. But I stayed silent. I chose reputation over justice. I didn't pull my hand away. I didn't cry either. There were no tears left in me for this moment. I had survived winters without family, court victories without congratulations, graduations with no one cheering. I'd learned how not to expect. And I'd learned how to move forward without needing forgiveness. I don't need an apology, I replied, my voice barely above a breath. I just need you to stop protecting lies. He nodded, closing his eyes for a moment like he was trying to absorb every word into his bones. I sat down in the chair beside him, still holding his hand. Elizabeth, yes? I never knew how to love you properly. You weren't like Matthew. You didn't obey, didn't try to please anyone. And I was wrong. To think that made you shameful. I stayed silent. I didn't know how to respond to that. It took a few seconds before I found the words. There were times I wished I knew how to stay quiet like Matthew. Maybe everything would have been easier. He shook his head slowly. If you had stayed quiet, you wouldn't be Elizabeth. And this family would have lost every shred of decency. Outside the door, I heard soft footsteps. It was my mother. She stepped into the room, her eyes meeting mine, then shifting to my father. The air seemed to soften. I stood up to give her space, but he held onto my hand. Stay, he said, voice weaker now. Just a little longer. I sat back down, for the first time in years, in the same room with the two people who had once seen me as the crack in their perfect wall of prestige. But this time, I didn't feel small. I was myself. I was the woman they had once rejected, and I had come not to be accepted but to remind them I had never disappeared. I didn't forgive. But I was here, in that cold white room, in the middle of the night, beside the man who had turned his back on me when I needed him most. And for the first time, he was no longer Dr. Robert Harper, the man who graced the covers of medical journals, who spoke at international conferences, who patted Matthew on the shoulder as though he was the only one worthy of the Harper name. He was just my father, and he was finally learning how to speak the truth. I was reviewing weekly court reports from my clerk when my personal phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name, Lauren Davis. My heart skipped a beat. It had been days since that rehearsal night since Lauren walked away amid stunned silence and eyes that stared at me like I'd just interrupted a dream mid-sentence. I didn't know if I wanted to hear from her right now, but my hand picked up the phone anyway. Elizabeth, it's me, Lauren. Her voice didn't carry the lightness it once had. It was the voice of someone who had just pulled themselves out of a sleepless night, still reeling from a shattered belief. I'm listening, I said, keeping my tone neutral. I need your help, but it's not about Matthew. I waited, silent. There's a group of patients, family members of those treated at Harper Hospital 7 years ago. They just filed a class action lawsuit. I'm their legal representative. I went still. Why you? I asked. I was once a victim. In a property dispute, I almost lost my house because of a documentation error. A doctor from Harper signed off on a report claiming my grandmother was mentally unfit to block a land sale. I didn't know the connection at the time, but I never forgot the feeling of being made invisible. She took a deep breath. I used to admire you, and when I found out you were Matthew's sister, it all made sense. Why you fought so fiercely. You understand what it's like to be crushed by a system you once believed in. I leaned back in my chair, eyes drifting toward the framed photo on the wall, me standing with a team of attorneys after a major victory for justice. I used to think justice was cold and impartial, but now it was knocking on my own door in its own way. I can't take the case, I said. Conflict of interest. I have direct ties to the accused. I know, but you could advise from the outside. I need someone who understands the system from within, and I believe you're the only one who won't bow down. That afternoon, while I was still weighing Lauren's request, Matthew showed up. No warning. No call. He stood at my front door, shirt wrinkled, tie undone, looking nothing like the polished doctor the world knew. I didn't invite him in, but he walked straight past me as if boundaries no longer applied. You have to stop this, Matthew said. You know those claims only show part of the picture. With Patterson, you're still angry at Dad, so now you want revenge, right? I clenched my fists. You think this is about me being angry? Elizabeth, if this lawsuit moves forward, Harper Hospital will collapse. Do you know how many people depend on it? Over 1,000 employees. An entire community relying on our healthcare system. I let out a cold laugh. Our system? When did I ever count as part of our anything, Matthew? He looked at me. Silent. 1 second. 2. We're family. No matter what. If you don't help, everyone loses. I turned my back to him. Have you ever thought about everyone your hospital has already cost? The ones who didn't get back up, who lost their chance at life because of a forged signature, a fake result, a decision made for profit over people? Matthew stepped closer. I'm sorry I made you carry it alone back then, but things are different now. I've changed. I faced him again, eyes locked on his. It's not about whether you've changed. It's about whether you're finally willing to let the truth come out. He said nothing. Just stood there, eyes pleading, but deep down, I knew Matthew still didn't understand. To him, justice was still a negotiation. That night, I sat in my office beside a copy of the case file Lauren had sent over. Every name, every medical report, every complaint dismissed for lack of grounds. Each page felt like a blade reopening old wounds. But also like a reminder, I was no longer alone. I couldn't sit on the bench for this trial. But that didn't mean I couldn't act. Not for revenge. But to restore something my family once treated with disregard truth. I called Lauren back. I agree. But under one condition. Name it. I'll be the one to build the rebuttal strategy and advise the entire process. But not for name recognition. Not for prestige. I'll do it so every testimony in that courtroom won't be distorted by power. Lauren was silent for a few seconds, then replied, That's all we hoped for. I looked out the window. The city lights shimmered. Below was the street I used to wander on winter nights, after leaving home with nothing but a suitcase and my scholarship documents. The circle was closing. But I was the one holding the pen to write the ending. And I would write it with truth unmasked, uncompromised. Because no one else could do it but me. That morning in New York was overcast. The air felt heavy, as if it too was trying to choose between right and wrong. I sat at my desk, facing two files. One was a strategic rebuttal proposal for the plaintiff group led by Lauren. The other was a transcript of my conversation with Matthew from the night before. That night, he didn't say much, just repeated that he didn't want our father to die in disgrace and that he'd do anything to make things right. But when I asked, Are you willing to admit it publicly? Matthew fell silent. For a long time, that silence stayed with me through the night. It didn't feel like remorse. It felt like fear. Fear of losing the image he spent his life crafting, the perfect doctor, the golden son, the man of the people. I understood him. Not because I was forgiving, but because I'd once stood at the same crossroads. Stay silent to preserve or speak out to confront. By noon, I reached out and arranged to meet Matthew at a small cafe near Central Park. The place was quiet. He arrived on time. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were steadier. Elizabeth, he began, if you came here to tell me to run, I'm sorry I can't. I looked him straight in the eye. Good, because I didn't come to tell you to run. I came to give you a choice. I placed a draft in front of him. It laid out 3 points. First, Matthew would admit to his involvement in altering past medical records. Second, he would voluntarily step away from the medical field, not because his license was revoked, but as a personal decision. Third, he would transfer his entire inheritance from the hospital into a community fund offering free healthcare to low-income patients. The fund would be named after our grandfather, the only one in the family who ever chose truth. Matthew didn't speak for several minutes. He held the paper, flipping through the pages. His hands trembled slightly. You're not leaving me any other choice, are you? He whispered. I took a sip of coffee. You have a choice. You can stay silent, go to court, and let the public tear you apart. But if that happens, you won't just take down our parents or the hospital. You'll take down the dignity of everyone who ever believed in you. He looked up. So, you want me to confess in public? At an official press conference, live broadcast. Not to humiliate you, but so justice won't be abandoned. Halfway. You made mistakes. But at least now, You have a chance to make amends as an adult, not a child hiding from consequences. We left the cafe in silence. I didn't push him for an answer. I knew the choice required more courage than any surgery he'd ever performed. 3 days later, Matthew sent me a short message. I'll do it, but you have to stand beside me. I arrived at the city's press center that afternoon, where the conference was scheduled. Outside, rows of news vans lined the street. Reporters packed the entrance, cameras glowing like a Broadway stage. No one knew exactly what the press conference was, for they only knew Dr. Matthew Harper had something to reveal. As we walked onto the stage, I followed one step behind him. I didn't speak. I just stood there, like a shadow reminding everyone that truth is never alone. Matthew stepped up to the microphone. His face was pale, but his voice steady. I'm Dr. Matthew Harper. Today, I'm not here as a medical expert or the son of a prominent medical family. I'm here to take responsibility for mistakes I've made. The entire room held its breath. Years ago, during a treatment that went tragically wrong, instead of reporting honestly as required, I let fear cloud my judgment. My family handled the aftermath by placing blame on someone else that someone was my sister. A few camera shutters clicked. Some journalists began scribbling notes. I saw Lauren in the back row, her face no longer angry, just quietly compassionate. I'm not saying this for forgiveness, Matthew continued, but because I've reached the limit of living a lie. As of today, I am stepping away from the medical profession. I will also transfer my entire inheritance into a community fund, the Henry Harper Fund, dedicated to providing free healthcare to those who can't afford it. He bowed his head. I'm sorry. To everyone who believed in me, especially Elizabeth. In that moment, I didn't feel relief or satisfaction. Just a strange stillness, as if time had paused to let something impossible become real. No one clapped. But no one threw stones. The cameras captured a man learning to face his own mistakes, not as a failure, but as a human being. We left the stage in silence. As we stepped off the platform, Matthew turned to me and said softly, "Thank you." "Even if I don't deserve it," I replied, eyes forward. "You don't need my forgiveness. Just don't turn away from the truth again." And we walked on, through the soft afternoon breeze of May, where justice no longer lived in books but in the choices we make each day, even when the price is our reputation, our tears, or our own family. A year passed like a blink between two breaths. But for me, it was a long journey of healing, reckoning, and rebirth. That press conference didn't just close a decade of buried mistakes, it opened a new chapter. Not just for my family, but for everyone ever hurt by the polished hands of false virtue protected by wealth and reputation. I received my appointment letter from the president on a morning in June, as jasmine bloomed white outside my office window. The court secretary emailed with a simple subject line, "Appointment confirmed. Judge Elizabeth Harper, United States Court of Appeals, Ninth Circuit." I sat in silence for several minutes. Not because I was surprised, but because even I hadn't believed that a girl once called a troublemaker by her own family could one day stand where only fairness and courage had the right to speak. Lauren was the first to arrive at my office to congratulate me. She brought a bouquet of sunflowers and a new folder. "This is a formal collaboration proposal between our foundation and the Texas Community Law Network," she said, her smile gentle but resolute. "They want to work with us to build an emergency legal aid hotline for families denied medical care due to lack of insurance." I nodded and took the folder, then looked straight into Lauren's eyes. Every time I faced her, I was reminded of that night when she walked away from the dinner table with tears streaming down her face, and Matthew screamed accusations like a man too exhausted to keep pretending. "Thank you for not turning your back on justice, Lauren," I said softly. She smiled. "It's not because I'm noble. It's because you were the first person who believed I could be stronger than his family's judgment." We became a team, not quite close friends, but women who had walked through the same mud and figured out how to hold each other's hands toward the light. Twice a week, we held free legal counseling sessions for immigrant communities in Brooklyn and Queens. The stories of each woman, each elderly man, Each single mother seeking help reminded us, justice doesn't begin in courtrooms, it starts in those moments when we listen without judgment. Matthew now lives in New Mexico, in a small town called Santa Rosa. He's written nearly 60 handwritten letters to the families of patients connected to the incident years ago, not to beg forgiveness, but to make amends. The nonprofit clinic he runs operates steadily, funded by my grandfather's estate and supported by a few independent medical organizations. One day, he sent me a photo with a group of young nurses, along with a caption, "Now I listen before I diagnose. Seems to work better than it used to." I didn't reply, but I saved the photo, placing it in a folder named Not Becoming Them. One early fall afternoon, I returned to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, where my grandfather rests. I brought with me a small box wrapped in gray velvet. Inside was the first button from my judicial robe, the one that popped off on swearing-in day because I pulled the zipper too hard in the waiting room. I knelt and wiped the dust off the engraved stone. Henry Harper, 1928 to 2013. A man who chose what was right, even when it made him forgotten. I placed the button on the stone, my palm trembling slightly. "I don't need to beat them," I whispered into the wind. "I just need not to become them." No one answered, but I could feel his warmth as if he were standing behind me, resting his hand on my shoulder, not saying a word, just nodding. I stood up and walked back to the car. In the sky above, golden sunlight filtered through maple leaves turning red. Nothing feels more radiant than the moment you know you're on the right path, even if that road was once clouded by mistakes and silence. As I sat behind the wheel, I suddenly remembered something my grandfather once told me when I was little, on a summer night when we sat on the rooftop watching the stars. "Eliza, justice isn't the sound of a gavel in a courtroom. It's the soft sigh of someone who's finally been seen as innocent after years of being called guilty." And I smiled. I'll keep listening, keep breathing deep, keep walking toward the truth no matter how long someone's tried to bury it. Because the legacy my grandfather left me isn't money, or hospitals, or fame. It's the courage not to stay silent when what's right is being smothered by what's easy. And the ability to forgive, not to erase the past, but to give myself a path forward. What about you? What would you do if one day, the people who once turned their backs on you stood before you no longer proud, no longer shining with status but simply human, with their mistakes and hope for forgiveness? Would you turn away, stay silent, or speak so you could finally close a painful chapter? I chose not to become them, but I also didn't live to get revenge. I lived to remind myself that truth, no matter how long it's hidden, will always rise, if someone is willing to be its keeper. And what about you? If you were in this story, would you choose justice or family? Share your thoughts below. I truly want to hear them. Every story is a mirror, sometimes reflecting wounds, but also helping us see the path we need to walk. And if you're drawn to real-life journeys where people clash, forgive, and sometimes rise from the very wounds inflicted by their own families, don't forget to follow this channel. So many stories are waiting for you. Stories not just to hear, but to feel, to reflect on, and to carry with you as you move forward stronger.